Poor girl embarrasses herself in front of the millionaire, and he falls madly in love. But what happens next, no one expected. Before starting the story, comment on where you're watching from. I want to know how far this video has come. Charlotte Hayes was running through the streets of Santa Monica that sunny morning, late as usual. Her alarm had gone off at 6:30, but she hadn't woken up until 7:15, lost in a dream about the novel she'd been writing for months. She jumped out of bed in a panic, threw her notebook in her bag, grabbed a cup of coffee and flew off to catch the 7:45 bus. But the universe laughed at her. The bus passed while she was still 2 blocks from the stop, distracted by an idea for her story. "You're kidding me," she shouted, watching the vehicle disappear. There was no choice. She had to run. With her bag slung over her shoulder and a cup of coffee dangling from her hand, Charlotte set off for the Café da Esquina, where she worked. Her shift started at 8 a.m., and the clock read 7:58. Gasping, she pushed open the glass door with her shoulder. The place was empty except for Lily, her colleague, who was quietly washing cups behind the counter. "Thank God," muttered Charlotte. But her haste came at a cost. The door slammed and coffee flew out of the cup, soaking her white blouse. "No," she exclaimed, staring at the spreading brown stain. "Why today?" she grumbled, dropping her notebook on the counter and running for napkins. She rubbed her blouse, but the stain only got worse. Giving up, Charlotte went to the mirrored glass of the cafe to assess herself. She saw a disheveled version of herself, messy blonde hair, a ruined blouse, and a face of despair. Then she noticed a drop of coffee on her jeans. "Really?" she huffed, leaning over to wipe it off, rubbing her pants right in front of the glass in an awkward dance. As she squirmed, she glanced at her reflection and froze. A man was watching her, sitting at a corner table with a discreet smile. Charlotte turned slowly and her heart stopped. He was beautiful, a real movie star, with piercing blue eyes, wavy brown hair, and an irresistible charm. Shame swallowed her whole. She tried to disguise it by rubbing her pants more naturally, but it was too late. He had seen everything. "Do you need a real mirror, or are you doing well with the glass?" he joked, his voice soft and amused. Her face burned, as red as a tomato. "Oh, I spilled coffee," she stammered, wanting to hide under the counter. He smiled wider. "It happens. At least you put on a show while you're cleaning up." She didn't know whether to laugh or cry, but she just wanted to disappear. Trying to pull herself together, Charlotte grabbed a red lipstick from her handbag and smeared it on her lips in a hurry, thinking it would save her. She ran to the counter, her hands trembling, trying to look normal. But the plan failed. The lipstick had stained her front teeth and she hadn't even noticed. She hid behind a cloth, wiping the counter, as if nothing had happened, until he approached. "A croissant, please?" he asked with a slight smile. Charlotte nodded, picking up the croissant with her tongs, but he added, "Oh, and you have lipstick on your teeth." She widened her eyes, ran to the glass, and saw the damage. Red-stained teeth. "Oh my God," she exclaimed, rubbing her teeth with her finger, her face now a shade of red that rivaled the lipstick. "That's not happening," she muttered, as he laughed quietly, clearly enjoying himself. "Relax, I've seen worse," he said, picking up the croissant. "I doubt it," she retorted, desperate. He returned to the table but continued to watch her with that enigmatic look. 2 hours later, he put away the laptop he was working on, left a generous tip, and left without saying another word. Charlotte stared at the door, her heart racing, still confused by the man who had made her so nervous. But there was no time to think. She had to get to Harrington Publishing. It was the last day to submit her manuscript to the literary competition, her chance to fulfill her dream of being published. She grabbed her notebook and rushed there. In the middle of the afternoon, Charlotte arrived at the publishing house, nervously clutching her manuscript to her chest. A receptionist took her to the owner's office for a quick interview. As she entered, the man behind the desk turned and the world stopped. It was him, the star of the coffee shop, the one who had laughed at the lipstick on his teeth and ordered the croissant. "No, it can't be. You?" he let slip, his voice coming out louder than he wanted. William Prescott raised an eyebrow and smiled, clearly enjoying himself. "Myself," he said, with a calmness that only made Charlotte more nervous. She blinked in disbelief. You own the publishing house?" "Surprise?" he asked, leaning back in his chair. Surprise, I wanted to disappear. Charlotte tried to laugh, but all that came out was a strange sound, almost a sob. I just didn't expect it to be you. Even I didn't expect to see you twice in one day, he commented, crossing his arms. But I admit I'm curious. He pointed to the manuscript on the table. Let's see if you can surprise me as much with your writing as you did earlier today. She felt her face burn. He was referring to the awkward moments in the cafeteria, the clumsy dance on the glass, the lipstick on her teeth, everything. Oh, about that, she began, but he held up his hand, interrupting her. Relax, he said, smiling again. It happens to everyone. Not to everyone, thought Charlotte, just me. Well, she muttered, trying to sound professional. I hope my writing is better than my morning. William laughed softly. I hope so too. He picked up the manuscript and lifted it slightly. I'm going to read it with great curiosity, Charlotte swallowed, knowing that this man, who had seen her at her worst moments that morning, was now judging her greatest passion was almost unbearable. Good luck, Charlotte, he said with a twinkle in his eye. I'm going to need... Charlotte Hayes left Harrington Publishing that afternoon with her heart racing. The manuscript she clutched to her chest felt lighter, but her mind was in chaos. William Prescott, the man who had laughed at the lipstick on her teeth in the cafeteria, who had ordered a croissant with an intriguing smile, was the owner of the publishing house that held the fate of her dream in his hands. And what's more, he had shown a genuine interest in what she had written. Let's see what you've got here, he had said, in a voice that mixed curiosity with something deeper, something she couldn't quite put her finger on. As they walked through the streets of Santa Monica, the sun was setting, dyeing the sky warm shades of orange and pink. Charlotte took a deep breath, trying to organize her thoughts. He's just the owner of the publishing house, Charlotte. Don't get your hopes up, she muttered to herself. But it was impossible to ignore the way he stared at her, with those blue eyes that seemed to pierce through her defenses, and the brief touch of their arms in the cafeteria. Was it just her imagination? Over the next few days, Charlotte went back to work at Café da Esquina, but everything seemed different. Every time the doorbell jingled, she looked up, expecting to see William walk in with his laptop and that subtle smile. He didn't appear. Maybe he was busy with the competition, she thought, or maybe that meeting at the publishing house was just an unimportant moment for him. Still, she couldn't get him out of her mind, his calm voice, the way he made her laugh even in the most embarrassing moments. A week later, while she was scrubbing the counter in the cafeteria, the phone rang. Lily, her colleague, answered and quickly covered the phone with her hand. Charlotte, it's for you. A William Prescott. Her heart leapt. For me? She picked up the phone with trembling fingers. Hello? Charlotte, this is William, he said, his voice warm and familiar. I hope I'm not disturbing your shift. No, it's fine, she replied, trying to sound nonchalant. What happened? I read your manuscript, he said, pausing for what seemed like an infinite moment. And I'd like to talk to you about it. In person. Can you come to the publishing house tomorrow afternoon? Charlotte swallowed. Yes, of course. I'll be there. Perfect. See you tomorrow then. He hung up, leaving her with the phone in her hand and her stomach churning. He had read the manuscript, and he wanted to talk in person. Was that a good thing? Bad? She wasn't sure, but she was as nervous as ever. That night, Charlotte reread her novel, trying to imagine it through William's eyes. It was a story of forbidden love between a young artist and an older man, full of secrets and twists. She had poured her soul into every page, but now she wondered if it was enough. What if he hated it, she thought, biting her lip? Or what if he liked it? Uncertainty devoured her. The next day, she arrived at the publishing house at the agreed time, wearing a green blouse that highlighted her brown eyes. The receptionist took her to William's office, and there he was, standing, leafing through her manuscript. Charlotte, come in, he said with a warm smile. Have a seat. She settled down, her hands sweating. So, what did you think? William leaned back in his chair, his eyes fixed on hers. It's good. Very good, in fact. Your writing is intense, emotional, and you have a unique voice. But... He paused, and her heart dropped. The ending feels rushed, and some characters need more layers. Charlotte nodded, feeling relief and anxiety at the same time. I can adjust that. Thanks for the feedback. But there's more, he said, leaning forward. I want to help you refine this manuscript, not just for the competition, but for publication. I think it could be a success." Her eyes widened. "Publication? Really?" "Really," he confirmed, smiling openly. "But it will take effort and time. Are you up for it?" "Yes," she exclaimed, almost jumping out of her chair. "Of course." William laughed, a sound that warmed the room. "Good. How about we meet up a few times a week to revise together?" Charlotte agreed, her heart light. They arranged the first sessions, and as she got up to leave, William walked her to the door. "Ah, Charlotte," he said, his voice lower, "you have a rare talent. Don't doubt it." She smiled, her face warm. "Thank you, William. That means a lot." Over the next few days, they began to work together. They would meet at the publishing house, in cafes, or even on the beach, with the sound of the sea in the background. Each session mixed intense work with relaxed conversations. William was demanding but kind, and Charlotte absorbed every suggestion. Between the lines of the manuscript, however, something else blossomed. Long looks, exchanged smiles, subtle touches as they flipped through the pages. One afternoon, while they were revising a chapter in the coffee shop where Charlotte worked, William flipped through the pages while she sipped a cappuccino. "This scene here," he said, tapping his finger on the page, "when the protagonist confesses that she's in love. It's strong, but something's missing. It seems she's not afraid to expose herself. What if she had doubts, if she felt she could lose everything by saying it?" Charlotte slowly put down her cup, his words echoing in a way that seemed too personal. "Do you think she should hesitate?" "I think so," he replied, his eyes fixed on her. "Because when you're really falling in love, it's scary, isn't it?" The question hung in the air. Charlotte opened her mouth to answer, but nothing came out. Because yes, she knew exactly how it felt, and his presence there so close made it impossible not to think about it. "I'll rewrite that part," she said, looking away and scribbling something on her notepad. "Good idea," murmured William, and Charlotte felt that he was still watching her. The meetings became more and more frequent. Sometimes they met at the publishing house, sometimes at the coffee shop, and on one surprisingly cold afternoon, they ended up sitting side by side on the sandy beach, protected by heavy coats and with a thermos of coffee shared between them. "I've always wanted to write," said Charlotte, hugging her legs and looking out to sea. "But I never thought I was good enough." William stared at her for a moment, then picked up the mug she was holding and took a sip. "If you weren't good enough, I wouldn't be here," he said with a half-smile. She laughed, but there was something else in her gaze. "You always look so sure," she commented, "as if you knew exactly what to do." He laughed, a low, sincere sound. "I'm only good at pretending. The truth is, sometimes even I don't know if I'm on the right track." Charlotte turned her face towards him, surprised by his confession. "Really?" "Of course," he said, looking at the horizon. "Running a publishing house isn't just about reading good books. It's about making difficult decisions, taking risks on what could go wrong. It's scary too." "But you make it look easy," she said, smiling slightly. "Just like you make it look easy to write about love," he retorted. She was silent for a moment, feeling her heart race. She didn't know if it was the afternoon chill or the way he looked at her, but her chest felt tight, and a part of her wanted that moment to last a little longer. "Can I ask you something?" said William, his voice softer. "Of course. Have you ever lived one of those stories you write?" The question caught her off guard. Charlotte tried to laugh, but it came out shaky. No. At least not like in the books." He didn't say anything, just nodded thoughtfully. The silence that followed was strange and intense, as if they both knew there was something unspoken hanging between them. "Well," said Charlotte, trying to break the tension, "I think we'd better finish revising the next chapter tomorrow." "Of course," agreed William, but instead of just nodding and leaving her there, he stood up and held out his hand to help her do the same. "Come," he said, his voice soft. She took his hand, and the instant she stood up, she lost her balance on the soft sand. William grabbed her around the waist, pulling her against his chest. For a second, Charlotte remained motionless, her eyes locked on his. His breathing was slow and warm, and his hands were still firmly on her waist. The world seemed to quieten down, and she was sure that he felt it too, that electricity in the air, the magnetism that made her forget how to breathe. He tilted his face slightly, and Charlotte felt her heart race. If he kissed her, If he kissed her now. But before anything could happen, his cell phone started ringing. William closed his eyes in frustration and took his phone out of his pocket. Charlotte accidentally looked down at the screen and saw a name light up on the display. Sarah. Sarah? He answered quickly. Hi. Yeah, I'll call you back, okay? His voice sounded firm but brief. He hung up almost immediately and put his cell phone away. Sorry, he said a little awkwardly. Shall we? Charlotte forced a smile. I'm going to stay here for a while, she lied. I want to think about some ideas for the book. He hesitated. Are you sure? I can take you home. No need, really, she replied too quickly. I'm fine. William looked suspicious, but didn't insist. Okay. So, I'll see you tomorrow? Yes, she murmured. He smiled slightly as if he wanted to say something more, but just nodded before walking away. Charlotte stood there watching him walk away across the sand, her mind racing. Sarah. As soon as he was out of sight, Charlotte walked straight to the cafeteria. Lily was behind the counter, distractedly munching on a donut when she saw her friend enter. Hey, weren't you going home? Asked Lily in surprise. I need to tell you something, said Charlotte, sinking into the nearest chair. Lily sat down opposite her, already interested. Why do you look like that? Charlotte ran her hands through her hair nervously. I think there's something going on between me and William. I knew it! Lily banged on the table, excited. I always thought he was into you. It's not that simple, interrupted Charlotte. We were on the beach talking and he pulled me, like, we got really close and he almost kissed me. What? And you're here instead of with him now? It wasn't like that. Charlotte took a deep breath. His phone rang just then, and the name on the screen was Sarah. Lily frowned. Sarah? Who's that? I don't know, said Charlotte, her voice coming out weaker. But he said he'd be back later. If it had been someone from the publisher, he would have said so right away, wouldn't he? I don't know. It could be his girlfriend. Or not, suggested Lily. Charlotte shook her head. Even if she isn't, I don't know if I want that, getting involved with someone now, just with him. Why? Because... Charlotte stopped, hesitating. Because I'm afraid of falling in love. Lily smiled, leaning back in her chair. I think you're already halfway there, girlfriend. Charlotte lowered her gaze, her heart squeezing. That's what scares me. Charlotte spent the night tossing and turning in bed, unable to shake from her mind the image of William holding her on the beach, the firm touch on her waist, his eyes fixed on hers, and that almost inevitable moment when his lips seemed to come closer. But, above all, what was hammering away in her head was that name on her cell phone screen, Sarah. Let's play a joke on those who only read the comments. Write cookie below and only those who got this far will understand. Let's continue the story. She didn't know anything about William's personal life. He had never mentioned girlfriends, nor did he seem to be in a relationship with anyone. But what if he did? What if that almost kiss was just a slip, a passing impulse that he would forget as soon as he was back in someone else's arms? Charlotte tried to convince herself that nothing had really happened. It doesn't mean anything, she repeated to herself, but the truth was that it meant a lot. She was falling in love. The next day, after working in the cafeteria, she arrived at the publishing house earlier than planned. She had decided to concentrate solely on the book and forget about any romantic ideas that were forming in her mind. When William arrived, he seemed calm, as if nothing had happened on the beach. Good morning, he greeted, with that smile that always seemed to disarm her. Hi, she replied, trying to sound casual. The hours dragged by between notes, discussions about characters and ideas for the book's conclusion. Charlotte noticed that William was more distracted than usual. Sometimes he stared at the cell phone on the table as if he was expecting a call or avoiding one. When she saw Sarah S. name appear on the screen again, her stomach churned. Aren't you going to answer it? She risked asking, her voice coming out harsher than she had intended. William looked at the display and pressed the ignore button. It's just someone I need to talk to later, he said, looking away. Charlotte didn't insist, but that answer echoed in her mind for the rest of the day. Over the next few days, William remained distant. He still smiled and praised the progress of the book, but something had changed. The casual conversations became shorter, and Charlotte sensed that there was something or someone occupying his mind. That evening, Charlotte went to the cafeteria after work and found Lily at the counter. "You look terrible," said Lily, leaning on the counter. "Has something happened to William?" "He's acting strange," confessed Charlotte, leaning her head on her hands. "Distant, and that Sarah keeps calling. Did you ask who she is?" "I did," replied Charlotte. "He said no." Lily bit her lip thoughtfully. What if it's an ex-girlfriend? Or worse? What if he's still with her? Charlotte closed her eyes, feeling her stomach sink. The next day, she decided to focus on her work and the book. In the afternoon, she went to the publishing house, and during a break, when William left the room to get coffee, Charlotte saw his cell phone vibrate on the table. It was a message. Without meaning to, her eyes went straight to the lit screen. "Sarah, please, William, let me know if everything is all right. I'm worried." Charlotte's heart raced. The message sounded more desperate than romantic, but her name still bothered her. When William came back, she couldn't hold back any longer. "Who's Sarah?" she asked directly. He stopped at the door, surprised by the question. "She's a friend," he replied after a long pause. "Friend?" Charlotte laughed humorlessly. "Then why are you running away from her?" William closed the door behind him and approached, looking tired. "Because she's going through a difficult time, and I don't know how to help," he said, sincerity in his voice. "What kind of difficult time?" He hesitated. "It's complicated." "I'm here, William," said Charlotte, softening her tone. "You can trust me if you want to talk." For a moment, he seemed about to open up, but something made him pull back. I can't talk about this right now," he said, turning his eyes back to the manuscript on the table. "Let's focus on the book, shall we?" Charlotte nodded, even though she knew something was wrong. Over the next few days, Sarah's presence continued to hover like a shadow. The messages became more frequent, and William seemed increasingly tense. One evening, after a long revision session, William offered to walk her home. On the way, the two walked in silence along the empty sidewalk. "I know you're curious," he said suddenly. "And you're right. I should have told you." Charlotte stopped, staring at him. "Sarah is my sister," he confessed, his voice low. "She is facing serious problems, and I'm trying to help, but I don't know if I can." The tension Charlotte felt gave way to a mixture of relief and concern. "Why didn't you tell me before?" "Because it's complicated," he murmured. "Sarah has problems with bad things. She's trying to recover, but sometimes she disappears for days, and I don't know if she's okay or not." Charlotte felt a tightness in her chest. "William, I'm sorry," she said, gently touching his arm. I didn't want you to think I was a failure as a brother," he said, his voice breaking. "I'm supposed to protect you, and I can't." Charlotte moved closer. "You're not a failure, you're trying to, and that's a lot." For a moment he just stared at her, as if trying to decide whether he believed her words or not. Then, to her surprise, William pulled her into an embrace. Charlotte closed her eyes, feeling the warmth of his body and the accelerated rhythm of his heart. "Thank you," he murmured. From that night on, something changed between Charlotte and William. The embrace on the sidewalk had broken an invisible barrier between them, a link that now seemed impossible to ignore. In the days that followed, whenever they met to revise the manuscript, the energy in the air was different. Charlotte noticed his gaze lingering on hers, the pauses that were too long between one sentence and the next, and the way William sometimes seemed to want to say something, but would pull back at the last moment. That afternoon, sitting side by side in the publishing house, Charlotte tried to concentrate on the adjustments they were making to the final chapter of the book, but it was almost impossible with William so close. The warmth of his arm brushed against hers every time he leaned over to point to something on the paper, and his woody scent seemed to envelop her every thought. "I think this scene needs more intensity," said William suddenly, touching the page with the tip of his pencil. "Intensity," repeated Charlotte, almost stumbling over the word. "Yes, right here." He tilted his body to her side even closer. "The protagonist is once again on the verge of confessing that he's in love, but there seems to be something missing. He needs to hold back this feeling more, as if he were afraid." His tone was calm, but there was a discreet intensity in his voice that Charlotte couldn't ignore. "Hold the feeling?" she murmured, turning her face to face him. It was a mistake. He was so close that she could see every detail, the deep blue of his eyes, the firm line of his jaw, the subtle curve of the smile he always seemed to hold back. "Eh," William continued, his voice almost a whisper. "Sometimes you feel so much that you don't know if you should say it, or if it's better to keep it to yourself." Charlotte felt a wave of heat run through her body. His gaze was locked on hers, and the world around her seemed to dissolve. For an instant she was sure he was going to kiss her, but as if realizing this too, William looked away and pulled back slightly, sniffling. "I'm going to get a coffee," he said, standing up too quickly. Charlotte held her breath for a few seconds, feeling her heart pound in her chest. That night Charlotte couldn't sleep. The memory of William's gaze that contained spark haunted her. She knew there was something there. He felt it as much as she did. But then, why did he pull back? The next day they met in the cafeteria, where they decided to work on the last chapters of the book. The atmosphere was less formal, but the tension remained in the air. "This part is good," said William, pointing to a passage in the manuscript. "But I think you could explore what she feels more, the uncertainty." "What do you mean?" William looked up at her, his lips curving into a slow smile. "You know when you're so close to someone that you can almost feel what they're thinking?" He leaned over the table, his gaze fixed on her eyes. "And you know that any move, any wrong word, can change everything?" Charlotte felt the air drain from her lungs. He wasn't just talking about the book, she knew that. "Yes," she answered, almost voicelessly. His eyes dropped to her lips for a second, an instant too long to be accidental. Charlotte could almost feel his breath on her skin. But then Lily appeared beside them, carrying a tray with coffee and croissants. "I thought you might need a break," said Lily, with a mischievous smile that made Charlotte even more nervous. "Great idea," replied William, pulling away again. Charlotte tried to disguise her frustration, but she knew that the energy between them was growing and becoming increasingly impossible to ignore. After coffee, they went out and sat on the beach to finish. The protagonist. "He's confused," said Charlotte, biting her pencil. "He doesn't know whether to take a risk and declare himself." "Why?" asked William. "Because he's afraid of ruining everything," replied Charlotte, without realizing that she was actually talking about herself. "He knows that if he opens his heart, perhaps nothing will ever be the same again." William was silent for a moment. When he spoke, his voice was lower. "Maybe he should take a chance." Charlotte turned her face towards him in surprise. "You think so?" "Yes." William's gaze locked onto hers, and this time he didn't flinch. The cold wind blew, ruffling her hair, and William reached out to brush a loose strand away from her face. His fingers brushed her skin gently, and Charlotte caught her breath. She didn't know who leaned in first. She only realized when their faces were so close that she could feel his breath touch her lips. "Charlotte," William murmured, his voice hoarse, almost a plea. She closed her eyes, waiting. Seeing her there, with her eyes closed and her lips parted, William could no longer ignore the desire that was pulsing inside him. He approached her slowly, leaning in until his lips almost brushed the warm skin of her face. "Let's go somewhere else. Finish this chapter," he murmured, his voice husky, almost a whisper in her ear. Charlotte shivered from head to toe. She opened her eyes slowly and found William's intense gaze fixed on hers. Before she could say anything, he grabbed her hand and pulled her tight. There was no more hesitation in him. Charlotte's heart was pounding so hard that she could hardly feel the ground beneath her feet as he led her across the sandy, lighted streets to his apartment. The atmosphere there was welcoming, with bookshelves full of books and an open balcony from which the cool breeze gently wafted in. William went straight to the kitchen, got a bottle of wine and poured 2 glasses. "I've got an idea for the end of the book," he said, holding out a glass to Charlotte and holding her gaze with an intensity that took her breath away. "Oh, yeah," she murmured, trying to concentrate on his words and not on the way he was looking at her, as if he'd been holding something back for a long time. "Yes." William sat down next to her on the sofa, close enough for their knees to touch. "I thought that in the end, the protagonist might finally confess that he's always been in love, that he tried to resist, tried to pull away, but that in the end, he couldn't hold on to that feeling any longer." Charlotte blinked slowly, feeling his words weigh on her in a way that went far beyond fiction. "I liked that," she said, almost in a whisper. "Me too," replied William, his voice low, his eyes fixed on hers. They spent the evening fine-tuning the last details of the book, laughing, exchanging ideas, and celebrating the end result. Charlotte was happy. The story was intense, passionate, everything she wanted it to be. But now, she felt the wine beginning to warm her body, making her mind lighter and her senses looser. "I'll get a water," she said, getting up a little dizzy. She went into the kitchen, but as she took a step back into the living room, she tripped on the carpet. A small scream escaped her lips before William came out of nowhere and grabbed her around the waist. "Careful," he said, his voice almost a whisper. But he didn't let go. His hands remained firmly on her waist, and Charlotte felt the heat of his fingers burning her skin through the thin fabric of her blouse. When she looked up, their faces were too close, close enough that she could feel his breath touching her face. William stared at her for an endless second, a second filled with everything he had been holding in for so long. And then he kissed her. It was urgent, intense, as if he couldn't wait any longer. His hands slid down her back, pulling her closer, and Charlotte responded with the same hunger, her fingers tangling in his hair. The kiss was deep, fiery, and every touch seemed to set them both on fire. I've waited so long for this," William murmured against her lips, his voice husky with desire. "I wanted it to only really happen when we finished the book, and it was too hard to wait." Charlotte smiled, her eyes shining. "I waited for that too." He kissed her again, this time more slowly, more intensely, as if he wanted to keep that moment forever. And there, amidst muffled laughter, sighs and whispered words, they gave themselves completely to each other. No more barriers, no more doubts. Just the two of them, finally living what they had longed for. The sun was beginning to invade the apartment when Charlotte opened her eyes, feeling the soft warmth of William's body still close to hers. He was sound asleep, with one arm slung over her waist, and his face relaxed into an expression of serenity that made her smile. For a moment, she allowed herself to just stay there, watching him, as if trying to commit every detail of that scene to memory. His woody scent was still present on the sheets, and the memory of the night before made her heart race. But then she turned to the clock on the bedside table and saw the red numbers flashing 8:07. "Oh my God!" she exclaimed, jumping up. William stirred in bed, his voice hoarse and sleepy. "What's wrong?" "I'm late," she said, getting up in despair and searching the room for her clothes. He laughed softly, propping himself up on his elbows. "Again?" "Yes, and today is my shift with Regina. If I'm late, she'll kill me," replied Charlotte, as she fumbled to pull her blouse over her head. "Calm down," he said, throwing his legs off the bed and putting on a t-shirt. "I'll take you there." "Are you sure? I can take a cab." "I'll do it," he replied, getting up and picking up his car keys from the table. A few minutes later, Charlotte was ready, but before she left, William took her by the arm, smiling. "Hey, no spilling coffee on your blouse or staining your teeth with lipstick today, okay?" She laughed, remembering the messes from their first meeting in the coffee shop. "I'll try," she joked, and he leaned in to kiss her quickly on the lips. On the way, William held the steering wheel in one hand and kept the manuscript in his lap with the other. "I'm going straight to the publisher after I drop you off," he said. "I'll take your book for a final proofread and set a release date." "Are you ready to be a published author?" Charlotte laughed nervously. "Honestly, I still can't believe this is happening." "It's going to happen," he assured her, squeezing her hand lightly. "And it's going to be amazing." Charlotte arrived at work and told Lily everything as soon as she found her friend at the counter. Luckily, Regina asked to swap with Lily. "You're kidding!" Lily clapped her hands in excitement. "You and him! And now the book is going to publication? That's perfect." "I know," said Charlotte, still feeling a mixture of happiness and nervousness. "But what if the book isn't good enough? What if no one likes it?" "Hey!" Lily pointed at her with a firm expression. "Your book is amazing. I read every draft you sent me and cried 3 times. Now, we need to spread the word. We need to make some noise." "What are you thinking?" "Social media." Lily grinned mischievously. "We'll create a page about your book, post excerpts, make videos, get people curious before it's even released." The idea got Charlotte excited. Over the next few days, she and Lily began to promote the book, posting short excerpts from the story, videos of the writing process, and photos of Charlotte working with William. The response was swift, the followers grew, and many began to comment that they were eager to know the full story. Meanwhile, William was immersed in the preparations for the launch. He organized interviews, called the press, and ensured an elegant event to present the book to the public. But despite all the excitement, Charlotte began to feel a growing restlessness. Evenings with William were happy, but whenever she tried to talk about the future, about what would happen after the book, he would change the subject or remain silent. On the eve of the launch, she found him at the publishing house, surrounded by papers and with his cell phone pressed to his ear. "Is everything all right?" she asked when he finally hung up. William sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Yes, just a few details about the event." "You look strange," said Charlotte, crossing her arms. "Are you hiding something?" He hesitated for a moment, but then smiled slightly. "I just want everything to be perfect for you tomorrow." Charlotte tried to convince herself that he was just nervous about the event, but a nagging feeling remained. On the morning of the big day, Charlotte woke up feeling anxious. Lily appeared in the cafeteria wearing an elegant black dress and flawless makeup. "You're going to look amazing," Lily assured her. "I just hope someone shows up," joked Charlotte, although her voice betrayed her real concern. Later, when they arrived at the venue, Charlotte was surprised. The publishing house was immaculate, decorated with flowers and huge banners with the book cover. Journalists were circulating with cameras, and several people were already crowding around the signing table. "Wow," she whispered, her heart racing. William appeared beside her, smiling proudly. "I told you it would be amazing." The evening was a success. Charlotte received countless compliments, signed books until her hand began to ache, and felt for the first time that she might actually be living her dream. But as the party went on, Charlotte noticed that William was distant. He was smiling and talking to everyone, but he seemed distracted, as if his mind was far away. Charlotte was standing in the corner of the room when she saw William walk discreetly away, his cell phone glued to his ear. She frowned, feeling a twinge of concern. She waited a few seconds before approaching, stopping close enough to hear part of the conversation. "Yes, I know," he said, his voice firm. "It's going to work. I'm sure this book will save the publishing house." Charlotte froze. Save the publishing house? Her heart raced. She took a few steps back, feeling a wave of insecurity. William hadn't told her that things were so serious. What was going on? A few minutes later, he returned to the lounge. Charlotte intercepted him before he joined the guests. "I heard you on the phone," she said, lowering her voice so as not to attract attention. "What's going on?" William took a deep breath and ran a hand through his hair, clearly tired. "I didn't want to worry you today," he began. "But there's been a problem with the printer. Part of a whole batch of books was printed faultily, and the loss was enormous. The publisher is in a difficult situation." Charlotte's eyes widened. "Why didn't you tell me before?" "Because I knew your book would be a success," he replied with conviction. "I was sure it would change everything, and now, seeing people here, reading and commenting on it, I know I was right." Charlotte's eyes filled with tears, not of sadness but of gratitude. He had bet everything on her even without telling her the truth. "Do you really believe that this story can work?" she asked, moved. "I don't just believe it," said William, holding her hands tightly. "I know it will work. And it's not just this book, it's you. I want you writing the best novels for my publisher." She smiled, feeling her heart overflow. "Then I'm going to write. I'll write the best novels this publisher has ever seen." William leaned closer, his gaze full of affection and desire. "And I'm going to love you to inspire you more and more." He kissed her passionately, wrapping his arms around her, as if nothing else mattered. The world around her disappeared. There was only the warmth of his body, the firm touch of his hands on her waist and his warm lips that seemed to devour her. Charlotte let herself go, her hands tangling in his hair. The kiss grew more intense, their breathing quickened. He slid his mouth down her neck and she closed her eyes, feeling every shiver spread across her skin. "William," she murmured, her voice trembling, "if we don't stop now." He laughed softly against her ear. "I know, but it's not easy to hold on." She pulled away a little, biting her lip with a mischievous smile. "Well, I'm already getting ideas for my next novel." He smiled, his eyes twinkling. "Then let's go home soon. I want you to finish the chapter you started here in my bed." Charlotte laughed, pulling him by the hand. "Then let's run away." They laughed together, walking quickly to the exit, exchanging kisses and complicit smiles on the way. The party ended successfully. Charlotte could hardly believe the number of people who had attended, the warm compliments she had received, and the readers who were already excitedly commenting on the story. But none of that mattered as much as the passionate look in William's eyes and the certainty that they were building something together, both in their personal and professional lives. That night in William's apartment, they celebrated in the most intimate way possible, laughing, toasting the future, and giving themselves to each other as if the world didn't exist outside. The next morning, Charlotte's phone wouldn't stop vibrating. She woke up to William still asleep beside her, his arm around her waist. She tried to sneak out, but he pulled her back into bed, murmuring in a hoarse voice, "Stay a little longer." "My cell phone is blowing up," she said, laughing. He opened his eyes slowly with a lazy smile. "I bet it's just people wanting to know who this amazing new author is." Charlotte picked up her phone and was surprised by the number of notifications. Instagram was full of messages, posts and comments about the previous night's event. "The most exciting story of the year. Get ready to laugh and cry at this addictive plot. Charlotte Hayes has won my heart." The praise multiplied. Readers shared touching snippets, highlighted their favorite characters, and already started asking for a sequel. "Look at this!" exclaimed Charlotte, showing William her cell phone. He got out of bed, still drowsy, and smiled as he read the messages. "I told you you were going to rock." Suddenly, William's cell phone also vibrated. He picked it up and quickly read the message. "It's from the publisher," he said, his voice filled with surprise. "They need to run a new batch of copies. The book is selling a lot more than we thought, and it's still 7 a.m. on a Sunday morning." Charlotte covered her mouth with her hands in disbelief. "It can't be." "Yes, it can," replied William, pulling her into a quick kiss. "You deserve it." She laughed, still stunned by the news. "I can't believe this is happening." "It's happening," he said, smiling, "and it's only the beginning." The next morning, Charlotte woke up feeling like she was still dreaming. Soft light flooded into William's room, and the distant sound of cars on the street reminded her that life went on outside. He was lying next to her, his arm around her waist, sleeping peacefully. Charlotte just watched him for a few seconds, still surprised by everything that had happened. Her book was becoming a success, the publisher was buzzing with excitement, and William was there. He was her anchor, her safe haven, and the man she loved more than she had the courage to admit out loud. She moved slowly, trying not to wake him, but he opened his eyes and smiled lazily. "Thinking of running away," he murmured, his voice hoarse from sleep. "I was trying to let you sleep," she said, smiling back. "Not at all." He stretched and in one swift movement pulled her to him, making her laugh. "You're going to make me late." "Today's a work day," she joked, although she made no effort to let go. "I'm taking you to the cafeteria, remember?" William raised an eyebrow with a satisfied smile. "And I want you to start thinking about how your life is going to change. Because believe me, things are only just beginning." Charlotte laughed, shaking her head. "I still can't believe all this." "You will," he said, holding her face affectionately. "And I'll be there every step of the way, reminding you how much you deserve all of this." In the cafeteria, Lily almost knocked over a tray when she saw Charlotte enter. She dropped everything on the counter and ran to hug her friend, jumping for joy. "I'm so happy for you," exclaimed Lily. "You're famous. Everyone's talking about your book." Social media was buzzing. People were sharing photos of the event, touching excerpts from the story, and praising the intense, emotionally charged writing. The publisher had just confirmed that the book would be translated into 3 languages and distributed internationally. Charlotte's name was beginning to gain traction in the literary world, and her life was changing too quickly for her to take it all in. The days that followed were a roller coaster. Charlotte was invited to interviews, TV shows, and literary events. She traveled from city to city, taking part in book fairs and meeting fans who were moved to tell her how her story had touched their lives. Every smile, every hug, every word of affection seemed like a dream that she still feared waking up from. William followed everything with pride. He encouraged her to write more, to take risks, and to trust her talent more and more. When she felt insecure or tired, he was always there, reminding her that she was strong enough to conquer the world. During a special event dedicated to new authors, Charlotte was invited on stage to talk about her writing experience. The audience was packed. Journalists, literary critics, passionate readers, and even well-known authors were there. Charlotte, nervous, took a deep breath before starting to speak. She told how she started writing to deal with pain, a pain she had been carrying for years. She talked about how she lost her mother at a young age, and about the lonely nights when she turned her grief into words on paper. Writing had been her way of surviving. Each story she created was an attempt to give new meaning to that pain, to find beauty in the midst of the emptiness that had accompanied her since her mother's death. Her voice faltered for a moment, and she had to stop to breathe. When she spoke again, her eyes were watery. "I spent a long time thinking that writing was just that, a way of escaping the pain," she said. "But then someone came into my life and showed me that writing can also be about love, about turning what hurts into something that heals, not only ourselves, but also others." She looked for William in the audience, and he was there, standing at the back of the hall, with a look so full of pride that she felt a lump in her throat. "I need to thank this someone," Charlotte continued, "because without him, this book wouldn't have been so special. He believed in me when I didn't believe in myself. He inspired me to write from the heart, and he's the reason I'm here today." The audience applauded warmly, but William remained motionless, just smiling, that smile that always disarmed her. Then he moved. With a bouquet of red roses in his hands, William walked down the center aisle and onto the stage. Charlotte laughed, thrilled, not knowing what was happening. "I was supposed to give you these later," he said, offering the flowers, "but now seems like the right time." She accepted the bouquet, still smiling, but then William reached into his jacket pocket, and her heart stopped. "Charlotte," he said, his voice breaking, "I saw you transform before my eyes. From a woman who wrote to hide her scars to an author who uses words to heal people, and you taught me that love is the most powerful force there is, because it transforms us, renews us, and gives us the courage to move on." His voice shook a little, and Charlotte could already feel the tears coming down her cheeks. "You're everything I ever wanted, and everything I didn't know I needed," he continued, taking a velvet box out of his pocket. He opened it slowly, revealing a silver ring with a sparkling stone in the center. "So, Charlotte Hayes, will you marry me?" The audience erupted in applause and emotional sighs. Charlotte brought her hands to her face, completely surprised. She looked at him, her eyes full of love and the expression of someone who would do anything for her. "Yes," she said without hesitation. "Yes, 1,000 times yes." William slid the ring onto her finger and kissed her with a passion that made the whole audience rise to their feet in applause and emotional shouts. People were crying, hugging each other and commenting on how much that story sounded like a real romance worthy of books. Backstage, Charlotte couldn't stop smiling. She turned to William, still stunned by everything that had happened. "Did you plan this all along?" she asked, laughing. "Of course," he replied. "I needed an ending worthy of one of your novels." She hugged him tightly, feeling that, for the first time in her life, there was no room for doubts or fears. She was exactly where she wanted to be, in the arms of the man who loved her, living the beginning of what would be her greatest and most beautiful love story. What did you think of the story? Leave your rating from 0 to 10 in the comments. Subscribe to the channel and activate notifications to receive our stories firsthand and also see this exciting story on screen.